family's secret was finally spilled in your family. Story 1. It wasn't until my cousin's wedding that the family secret came out. Everyone was gathered at the reception, enjoying the evening, when my aunt, who'd always been the life of the party, stood up to give a toast. She started off by reminiscing about our childhood and how much she appreciated all of us. But then, in an unexpected twist, she began talking about how she'd been hiding a part of her past. She shared that for years she'd kept the identity of her biological father a secret. Turns out my aunt had been adopted, but no one knew. None of us. Her adoptive parents had kept it from her for years. And even when she found out, she had chosen to keep it a secret to protect the family from any potential drama. But recently, she had reconnected with her biological family, and the truth finally came out during the wedding. We all sat there stunned, trying to process this new reality, but after some initial shock, we rallied around her. It was a wild evening, full of confusion and questions. But in the end, it brought the family closer. The unexpected revelation showed us that we all had a little more in common than we thought. Story 2. My family had always been a bit quirky, but no one expected the secret that came to light when my mother passed away. As we were going through her belongings, we found a small box tucked away in the back of her closet. Inside were letters, photos, and a marriage certificate, none of which we had ever seen before. The certificate revealed that my mother had been married before she met my dad. To make things even more confusing, she was married to a man who we had never heard of. The letters revealed that the marriage had ended abruptly due to a tragic event, but my mom never mentioned it to us. In fact, she had kept this part of her life completely hidden. We learned that she had been a widow before we were even born. It made sense why she'd been so protective of us and why she'd always refused to talk about her past relationships. It was a revelation that shook us, especially since we never got the chance to meet this side of her. We wondered why she had kept it from us all those years. It definitely changed the way we viewed her, but in some ways it made us admire her even more for her strength and ability to overcome her past. Story 3. My grandmother always claimed she had a perfect marriage. Her love story with my grandfather was like something out of a fairy tale, or so we thought. After her passing, we discovered a hidden diary of hers that completely contradicted everything she had told us. Turns out my grandmother had been married to someone else before my grandfather. She had kept the first marriage a secret because it was a very troubled relationship. The man she had been married to was abusive, and she had endured years of emotional and physical trauma before finally escaping. After leaving him, she went on to meet my grandfather, who was the love of her life. My grandmother never told anyone about her first marriage, until now. As we read the diary, we realized just how much pain she had endured, and it was heartbreaking to know that she had carried this burden alone for so many years. Her secret changed how we viewed her entire life story. We now understood the depth of her strength and resilience, even though she had kept this part of her life hidden for so long. Story 4. The family secret in our house wasn't something we expected to find, especially not during the regular family reunion we had each year. Everything was normal until my uncle, who was always quiet and reserved, started getting a bit too drunk. That's when he blurted it out. He wasn't really my dad's brother. As it turns out, my uncle was adopted into the family when he was a toddler, and my dad had been keeping that secret for years. At first, it was shocking. No one had ever suspected anything. There had never been any hint that my dad's side of the family was hiding anything. My uncle shared that when he was younger, he had always wondered why he looked different from the rest of us. But no one ever talked about it. His parents, who had passed away years ago, had kept the adoption a secret, and when he moved in with my dad's family, they agreed not to tell him about his biological parents. It was all a huge revelation that left everyone in the room in stunned silence. But after we talked about it, we realized that it didn't change anything. My uncle was still our family, and we loved him just the same. Story 5. I'll never forget the day my family found out my father had a whole secret family. I always wondered why my dad spent so much time traveling for work, but I never thought much about it until I was in college. One day, I received a call from a woman who introduced herself as my dad's ex-wife. She told me that she had 2 kids with my father, and they had been living in another city for years, completely unaware of our family. It turns out my dad had been married to this woman in his early 20s, and they had kids together before he met my mom. He never told us about them. She was angry and upset, but also wanted to make sure we knew the truth. It took a long time to digest, and I struggled with feelings of betrayal. My parents divorced shortly after, and my dad admitted to everything. He had been seeing this woman for years, but she had never been a part of his life with us. We eventually met my half-siblings, and though it was awkward at first, it brought a strange sense of closure to everything. Our family will never be the same, but in some ways, we've become stronger as we learn to navigate this unexpected twist in our lives. Story 6. I grew up believing I was an only child, raised by my single mother who was always very secretive about her past. I never questioned it because she was the only family I knew and I was content with our little world. Everything changed one night when I turned 18. My mom called me into the living room, her face serious, something I had never seen before. She handed me a letter and said it was from my father. At first I was confused. She had always told me he was out of the picture, but this letter seemed to suggest otherwise. My mom sat there in silence as I read it. It turned out that my father hadn't left us willingly. He had been coerced by his family to stay away. My mom's parents didn't approve of their relationship because my father came from a different background, and they forced him to disappear when she found out she was pregnant. My mom had been protecting me from the truth all these years, afraid I would hate her for keeping this secret. The letter explained that my dad had been trying to reach me, but he was too scared to face my mom after all those years. It felt like my whole world had shifted. I spent weeks trying to process this information, trying to understand why my mother had kept this from me for so long. Eventually, I reached out to my father and we met. It was an emotional reunion, and we spent hours talking about what had happened. He explained that he never wanted to leave us, and it broke my heart to learn how much pain he'd carried all these years. Now, at least I know where I come from, but the years of not knowing will never be something I can forget. Story 7. For as long as I can remember, my family has always had a tradition of going on a big family vacation every summer. We would rent a large cabin, spend time outdoors, and always end the trip with a big family dinner. But the last vacation I took with my family changed everything. On the final night, my cousin, who had always been the quiet and reserved one, suddenly stood up and gave an unexpected speech. She told us she had been holding something in for a long time and felt it was time to share the truth. She revealed that she had been living with a major addiction for years. It wasn't just recreational or something she dabbled in. It was a full-blown addiction to drugs. She explained how she had been hiding it from everyone, keeping it a secret because she didn't want to disappoint us. We had no idea, none of us. She had kept it hidden so well, even as it spiraled out of control. It was heartbreaking, to be honest. We all felt a mix of emotions: shock, sadness, and confusion. But the most surprising part was how the family rallied around her after the confession. Instead of rejecting her, we came together to offer support. Her courage in telling the truth opened up a space for others in the family to open up about their own struggles and pain. What started as a secret led to one of the most healing moments in our family's history. We understood that no one should have to face their battles alone. Story 8. Growing up, I had always admired my grandmother. She was the rock of our family, strong, loving, and always there when anyone needed her. But one day, when I was in my mid-20s, I overheard my mom talking to my aunt in the kitchen. The conversation was hushed, but I could still catch the words, "her past," and "you need to know." That's when I decided to ask my aunt directly what was going on, and what she revealed completely changed my perception of my grandmother. My grandmother had been a famous singer in her younger years, but her fame was short-lived. She had a child with a famous musician when she was in her early 20s, but when he got involved in a scandal, she chose to keep the child a secret to protect her career. The child was my mother's half-sibling, a sibling I never knew existed. My grandmother had raised my mom alone, and it was only after my mother's adulthood that she found out about her half-brother. But my grandmother had never spoken of him again. I confronted my grandmother about it, and she tearfully admitted the truth. She told me how much she regretted hiding her son and how it had torn her apart for years. She had wanted to reconnect with him but was too ashamed of her choices. At first I was angry. How could she hide something so big from the family? But as she explained the emotional turmoil she'd been through, I began to understand. We ended up reaching out to my mother's half-brother, and it was like meeting a long-lost family member. We welcomed him with open arms, and although the secret had been painful, it ultimately brought us closer together. Story 9. The secret in my family wasn't something that was intentionally kept, but rather something no one ever knew about until one of the oldest family members revealed it. It happened at my great-aunt's 90th birthday party, and we were all gathered in the living room when she dropped the bombshell. She had always been a mystery in the family, living in a quiet little house on the outskirts of town, never quite blending in with the rest of us. No one knew much about her past, but we loved her nonetheless. That day, she told us she had once been married to a man who we had never heard of. She described a whirlwind romance that took place before my great-uncle came into the picture. Apparently, this man was a well-known artist, and they were very much in love. However, after a few years of marriage, he had mysteriously disappeared and she never heard from him again. My great-aunt had never spoken of this man to any of us. She explained that she had kept the secret because, for years, she feared the man was involved in something dangerous, something that would ruin the family's reputation. The revelation came as a shock to everyone. It was like learning that someone had a hidden past we could never have imagined. But instead of feeling betrayed or upset, the family was fascinated. We had always thought of my great-aunt as the quiet, but her secret life added layers to her character that we never knew existed. It also helped us to understand some of the quiet moments she had, the times she would slip into deep thoughts. In the end, we all appreciated her honesty, and it became one of the most talked about stories at the party. Story 10. I was always the quiet one in the family, and my siblings and parents were close-knit and open about everything. So when the family secret came out, I was the last person I ever thought would be involved. It started when my sister, who had been married for several years, suddenly asked for a private conversation. She sat me down, looked me in the eyes, and told me she had been living a double life. For years, she had been secretly married to someone else. At first, I didn't understand what she meant. She explained that shortly after her first marriage, she had fallen in love with someone else. But instead of getting divorced, she had kept both relationships going. She had two husbands, each unaware of the other, and she had managed to balance both for over a decade. She didn't want to hurt either of them, but as the years went on, the weight of the secret became too much for her to bear. I didn't know how to react. I was completely shocked and felt betrayed, not just by her actions, but by the fact that I was the last one to know. My sister explained that she had kept the secret from everyone because she didn't want to ruin the family's reputation, and she genuinely loved both men. After a long and emotional discussion, she decided to come clean to both of her husbands. It took a lot of courage, but ultimately the truth came out, and the fallout was intense. It was a messy and painful process, but it was also liberating for my sister. For me, it was a lesson in the complexities of relationships and the power of secrets, and how, eventually, they all come to light. Story 11. When my mom was in the hospital recovering from a major surgery, I decided to go through some old family albums to pass the time. As I flipped through the yellowing pages of photographs, I came across an image that left me frozen. It was a picture of my mom with a man I had never seen before. They were standing side by side in front of a small house, smiling and looking like they were in love. What really struck me was how much he resembled my mom. He had the same eyes and smile, but I had no idea who he was. I immediately asked my dad about the picture. He hesitated and told me it was someone my mom had been involved with before they met. At first, I thought he was just being coy, but he eventually admitted that the man in the picture was my biological father. I was stunned. How had my mom never told me about him? My dad went on to explain that when my mom was in her early 20s, she had an affair with this man, who was married at the time. She had gotten pregnant. But after a difficult decision, she chose to raise me alone and never told anyone about the affair. My dad, who had been my stepfather since I was a toddler, had always thought of me as his own. The revelation was overwhelming. I had always considered my mom's history to be open and transparent, but this secret shattered that image. My mom was too ill at the time for me to confront her, so I sat with the truth for a while, reflecting on what it meant for our family. When she recovered, we sat down to talk. She told me about the heartbreak and guilt she'd felt over the years, but how she had never regretted raising me on her own. Though I was hurt at first, I came to realize that the love my mom and I shared was real, and nothing would change that. Still, meeting the man in the photograph was something I couldn't have predicted, and I still wonder what life would have been like had she chosen a different path. Story 12. My parents were always open and honest with us growing up, or so I thought. It wasn't until after my father's death that we learned the truth about a side of his life we had no idea existed. My dad had always spoken fondly of his childhood, telling us about the mischievous adventures he and his brothers used to have. But at his funeral, something strange happened. During the eulogy, my cousin, who had always been close to my dad, shared a story that none of us had ever heard. He talked about my father's early years and how, when he was in his late teens, he had been involved in some illegal activities. Apparently, my dad had been running with a group of friends who were involved in smuggling stolen goods across state lines. He had even been arrested once but managed to avoid any serious consequences, largely due to the intervention of his parents. We were all in shock, trying to piece together this hidden chapter of my dad's life. It was like learning that the man we had known and loved had once been a completely different person. My mother, who had been sitting quietly through the ceremony, confirmed the story later that evening. She explained that my dad had tried to erase that part of his life once he settled down with her. It was a secret he had kept from everyone, including us, his children. As we began to process this new reality, my siblings and I all found ourselves grappling with the idea of our father's hidden past. It was a difficult pill to swallow, but after discussing it as a family, we realized that everyone has their struggles and mistakes. My dad had changed, and his love for us had been unwavering. It taught us that the past doesn't always define a person, but it was still a revelation that left us questioning the version of our father we had always known. Story 13. My family was never short on drama, but there was one moment that really caught me off guard. I had always wondered why my aunt, who had been married for years, seemed to have a different relationship with her husband than anyone else. They were always affectionate and seemingly happy, But there was something off about their connection, an unspoken tension that was always there, like a wall between them. One night, at a family gathering, my aunt got a little tipsy and began telling stories about her past. She began with how she had met her husband and how they'd fallen in love, but then, in a half-joking tone, she mentioned that she'd actually been married to someone else before him. As she kept talking, her words grew more serious, and the room fell silent. She admitted that her first marriage had ended because her ex-husband had been abusive, and she had suffered both physically and emotionally for years. What no one knew, though, was that her ex-husband was not the person we all thought he was. Turns out, he was actually involved in organized crime, and my aunt had been hiding from his associates for years after she left him. We had always known my aunt as this confident, successful woman, but we never knew about the trauma she had endured. She had kept it a secret because she didn't want anyone to pity her, and she didn't want the family to be dragged into her past. As she told her story, she began to tear up, and we could see how much it still hurt. Everyone in the room was in shock, but we rallied around her, offering support and love. We realized that the strong woman we had always known was a survivor, someone who had fought for her happiness in ways we couldn't have imagined. It was a painful secret, but hearing it made us appreciate her even more, and we felt even closer as a family. Story 14. There's always been an unspoken rule in my family. Don't talk about your past if it's something you regret. That rule had been in place for as long as I could remember. My parents always emphasized how important it was to keep a good reputation and to avoid discussing anything that might embarrass the family. So when my aunt revealed a shocking secret at a family gathering, it was like a bomb had been dropped. During the dinner, she stood up and, in front of everyone, announced that she had once been married to a woman. She explained that when she was younger, she had fallen deeply in love with her best friend, and the two of them had gotten married. But soon after, they both realized that their relationship wasn't as perfect as they had hoped, and they ended things amicably. My aunt never told anyone about this part of her life, and she had kept it hidden from the family because she feared judgment. It was clear from the reactions around the table that no one knew how to respond. Some were surprised, some were confused, and others were quietly uncomfortable. But the more my aunt talked, the more she explained that her past had shaped who she was today. The decision to come out with her secret wasn't easy, but she felt it was time to be true to herself and to stop hiding. The revelation stirred up some tension within the family. There were those who took it in stride, offering their support, while others struggled to accept it. But in the end, my aunt's courage opened up new conversations about acceptance and understanding. We realized that her past didn't change the way we loved her. It only made her stronger, and in some ways, it brought us all closer together. Story 15. It wasn't until my grandmother's 80th birthday that we learned about the secret she had carried for so long. We had gathered for a family celebration at her house, as we always did, when she suddenly asked everyone to sit down. She had something to say. She began by talking about her early years, which no one in the family knew much about. She revealed that when she was in her 20s, she had been a nurse during World War II and had been stationed in Europe. During her time there, she met a soldier, a man she fell deeply in love with. They had a brief but intense romance, and my grandmother became pregnant. What she didn't tell us was that the man she loved was actually from a different country, and when the war ended, he was forced to return home. She never saw him again. My grandmother made the decision to raise the child alone and return to the States, where she eventually married my grandfather. For decades, my grandmother had kept her past a secret. She never spoke of the soldier or the child, but now, at 80, she felt it was time to share her story. She explained that she had never regretted raising my mother, but the memory of the love she had lost always stayed with her. Hearing this revelation was both heartbreaking and eye-opening. It added layers to my grandmother's character that none of us had known existed. We never imagined that she had a past so full of love and loss, and it made us realize how many untold stories our elders carry with them. We could only admire her for the strength and resilience she had shown over the years, never revealing her heartache, but continuing to love and care for her family in the way only she could. Story 16. Growing up, my family was always close-knit, or so I thought. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I found out my father had been keeping a massive secret from us. It all started one evening when I was at a family dinner. We were all sitting around the table talking about random things, when my uncle, who had always been a bit of a joker, suddenly went quiet. He had a serious look on his face, something I'd never seen before, and then he turned to my dad and said, "When are you going to tell them?" My dad froze, his face turning pale. Everyone at the table stopped talking, sensing something was off. My uncle's words hung in the air. "Tell them what?" my mom asked, looking between the two men. My dad then slowly put down his fork and sighed deep, as if he had been carrying a weight for years. He finally confessed that when he was in his 20s, he had been involved in a car accident, and the woman who was with him had died in that crash. But the real bombshell was that the woman was pregnant with his child at the time. For years, he had kept it a secret. Not just from us, but from everyone in his family. He had paid for the child's adoption and never told anyone, including my mom, about what had happened. My uncle knew because he had been with my dad during those days and had tried to help him deal with the guilt. But my dad never wanted to bring it up, not wanting to disrupt the life he had with my mom and us. We all sat there stunned, processing the new reality. It was a shock that left me feeling both betrayed and confused, but I also understood the kind of pain my dad must have endured. He had never mentioned it because of the guilt he carried, and my mom explained later that she had never known about the secret either. The evening ended in a strange silence, but the conversation sparked a lot of open discussion in our family. Though it didn't change anything about our relationship with my dad, it changed how we understood him, and we eventually reached out to the child, who turned out to be living nearby. Meeting him was both difficult and healing. Story 17. We always considered ourselves an open family. Nothing was ever too embarrassing to talk about. But that changed when my grandmother died. She had been the matriarch of our family, the one who kept everything running smoothly, and we had always believed that she had led a full, honest life. After her funeral, when we were going through her belongings, we discovered a stack of letters and old photographs hidden in the back of her closet. The letters were addressed to someone named Jack, a name none of us had ever heard in connection with her. Curiosity led us to read the letters, and we soon learned the shocking truth. My grandmother had been married to another man before she met my grandfather. The letters were from Jack, and they revealed that their love had been deep, passionate, and full of promise. However, Jack had been drafted into the military during World War II, and my grandmother had received word that he was killed in action. Heartbroken, she eventually married my grandfather, the man we all knew, and had children with. But as we read further, we realized that Jack hadn't been killed. He had survived the war, but due to the circumstances and pressures of the time, he had never reached out to her again. He had assumed she had moved on with her life. For some reason, my grandmother had never told anyone about Jack, not even her own children. When we confronted my mother, she revealed that she had never heard of Jack either. My grandmother had kept this part of her life hidden, not out of shame, but because she had been so devastated by the loss of Jack that she could never bring herself to talk about him again. It was a secret that reshaped how we viewed her. She had carried this love with her for decades, quietly cherishing it, and it made us realize just how complex and layered her life had been. We all agreed to honor her memory by embracing this part of her past and learning from her ability to keep such a deep secret for so long. Story 18. The secret that came to light in my family wasn't a single moment, but rather a collection of small, quiet revelations that had been unfolding over the years. My parents had always told us we were a perfect little family. We had the house, the yard, the vacations, everything that seemed ideal. But everything changed when I was 22 and started to do some digging into my parents' past. I had noticed little things over the years that didn't quite add up. Odd behaviors, certain looks exchanged between my mom and dad, things that made me wonder if they were hiding something. One day, I decided to ask my mom about it directly, and she finally admitted the truth. My dad had been married before. Not only had he been married, but he also had a daughter from that marriage, a daughter I had never known about. My dad had been married to a woman for a few years before meeting my mom, and they had a daughter, but the marriage ended in a bitter divorce. The daughter, who was only a year older than me, was raised by her mother, and my dad had kept her a secret from us all these years because he didn't want to confuse our family life. When I met my half-sister for the first time, I was overwhelmed. She had no idea about me either. My dad had never told her about our family. It was a complicated, awkward meeting. At first, we were both wary of each other, unsure of how to navigate this new relationship. But as we spent more time together, we learned that we had more in common than we thought. The initial tension faded, and we slowly started building a bond. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, but our shared history slowly became a bridge between us. The secret, once painful and confusing, eventually became a source of connection and healing. Story 19. When I was younger, my family always talked about our history with pride, often recounting the tales of our ancestors and their accomplishments. However, when my great-uncle passed away, we found something that changed everything we knew about our family's origins. During the process of cleaning out his house, my cousin discovered an old leather-bound journal hidden beneath the floorboards. It was filled with my great-uncle's notes, but what caught our attention were the details about his childhood. It turns out that my great-uncle had been born in a different country, and he wasn't really part of our family at all. My great-grandmother had been married to a man who was originally from Europe, but he had disappeared mysteriously when my great-uncle was just a baby. We had always thought of my great-uncle as a natural part of the family, but the journal revealed that he had been adopted into our family under very secretive circumstances. My great-grandmother had kept the identity of his real parents hidden for reasons that were never fully explained. As we read the journal, we uncovered more details, like how he had once gone back to the country where he was born, trying to find out more about his biological parents. The journey had been long and fruitless, and he had eventually given up, settling into the family we all knew. The revelation shook me. It felt like the foundation of our family had been built on a lie. I couldn't understand why my great-grandmother had chosen to keep it all a secret. When I confronted my mother, she told me that she had known about the secret but had never thought it was something worth sharing. She had always seen my great-uncle as part of the family, regardless of his origins. In a way, this secret had created a bond among us, one that didn't depend on blood but on love and acceptance. But knowing the truth still felt strange, like discovering that the history we had been told was not quite what we thought. Story 20. I had always admired my aunt for her independence and her unwavering confidence. She was the type of woman who never let anything faze her, and she always had the best advice to give no matter what. But I never knew the full story of her life until one evening, when she casually mentioned something in passing that completely blew my mind. We were sitting in her living room after a family dinner when, out of nowhere, she dropped the bomb. She revealed that for years, she had been secretly married to a man who none of us had ever heard of. It wasn't that she had been keeping him a secret, but rather that the marriage had been a quiet, private affair. They had met when she was living abroad, and they had a whirlwind romance. But the marriage didn't last, and she chose to never speak of it again, fearing the judgment of her family and friends. The more she spoke about it, the clearer it became that she had been deeply in love with this man. But their marriage fell apart because of cultural differences and misunderstandings that neither of them could overcome. She never told us because she felt ashamed of the failure and didn't want to risk losing the strong, independent persona she had worked so hard to build. The revelation came as a shock. I couldn't believe that someone who seemed so unshakable had once experienced such vulnerability. But as she explained her reasoning, I began to understand. She had kept the secret not out of guilt but out of a desire to protect herself from judgment. After hearing her story, I found myself respecting her even more for the courage it took to confront her past, even if it was in her own way. Her secret had been one of the most painful chapters of her life, but sharing it with us allowed us to see her in a new light. Story 21. I always thought that the biggest secret in our family was my great-grandfather's mysterious disappearance. He vanished without a trace when my grandmother was just a child, and no one knew what had happened to him. My grandmother always told us that he was a traveler and simply left one day, leaving behind nothing but questions and a few belongings. No one in the family ever really probed the story. Everyone accepted the version my grandmother had shared. But everything changed when my grandmother passed away. While going through her things, I found an old worn letter hidden in a drawer. It was addressed to my grandmother from my great-grandfather. At first, I thought it was just another love letter, but when I read it, I was stunned. The letter revealed that my great-grandfather had been involved in a dangerous gambling, and he had accumulated a massive debt that he could not pay. To protect my grandmother and the rest of the family, he had staged his disappearance, leaving behind everything he loved in order to escape the dangerous people who were after him. The letter also mentioned that he had fled to another country, where he was hoping to start over under a new identity. My grandmother, in her sorrow and pain, had kept this secret all her life, never telling anyone the real reason for his disappearance. The truth left me reeling, and I felt a mixture of anger and sadness toward the man I had never met. My grandmother had carried that burden for decades, living with the shame and the knowledge of what had really happened. It was a secret that reshaped my view of our family, and I wondered how things might have been different if she had shared the truth. Story 22. When I was growing up, my family was always very close, and we spent every holiday together. There was never a moment when someone was left out, and my parents always emphasized the importance of family. However, everything changed one summer when we had a big family reunion. I was 16, and my aunt, who had always been a bit of an enigma, started acting strange. She had been quiet all day, only speaking in short sentences, and her eyes seemed distant. During the evening, after dinner, she stood up to speak. She raised her glass and told us that she had something to share with everyone, something she had kept a secret for years. The room went silent as she began to speak, and she revealed that she had been married to a woman for several years before she met my uncle. She explained that she had been in love with her partner, but had to leave the relationship due to societal pressures. My aunt had never told us about this part of her life, even though we all assumed she had only ever been married to my uncle. The revelation was met with a mix of confusion, surprise, and acceptance. My mother and father seemed a bit taken aback, but as the evening went on, my aunt shared more of her story, how she had never felt safe being open about her sexuality, and how her marriage to my uncle had been a way for her to blend in. It was a painful and difficult truth for her to share, but by the end of the night, we were all supporting her. She explained that she had chosen to live a quiet life, keeping this part of her history private for fear of judgment. Her confession opened a door for others in the family to share their own secrets and struggles. It was the first time I realized how much we hide from each other, even within families that seem so close. That evening changed our family dynamic, making us more open and understanding. It wasn't easy, but it made me realize how important it is to be true to oneself no matter the cost. Story 23. My family always had a lot of cousins, aunts, and uncles around, and we all lived in the same neighborhood. As a kid, I never questioned the relationships between everyone because everything seemed so normal. But when I was in my late 20s, something came to light that completely upended my understanding of our family. It started with a random phone call from a woman who introduced herself as my cousin. She said she had some news for me, and I wasn't sure what to expect. When I met with her, she told me that she had been raised in a different state, and only recently found out that my uncle, whom we all adored, was her biological father. It turned out that years ago, when my uncle was in his 20s, he had a short-lived affair with a woman from his work, and she had gotten pregnant. The woman decided to keep the baby but never told my uncle about the pregnancy. Instead, she gave the child up for adoption, and my cousin was raised by another family without any knowledge of her biological roots. My uncle had kept this secret all these years. When I confronted him, he admitted that he had known about the child but had never wanted to disrupt the life he had with his wife and children. He didn't think my aunt would be able to handle the news, so he made the decision to remain silent. My cousin, however, had been searching for her biological family for years, and when she finally found him, he was overwhelmed with guilt and shame. It was a difficult situation for all of us. My uncle's betrayal to my aunt was one thing, but it also caused a ripple effect in our family. We had a new cousin, someone who had been right under our noses the entire time. The revelation was a shock to everyone, and it left me questioning how many other hidden stories there might be in our family's past. Ultimately, though, we welcomed her with open arms, and our family became a little bit bigger and a lot more complex. Story 24. My family had always been known for its large, boisterous gatherings. Every holiday was a spectacle, and nothing was off limits for conversation. It wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I learned a secret that had been quietly hidden for generations. The catalyst for this revelation was a routine visit to my grandfather, who had been ill for some time. I visited him one evening, and he asked me to sit down. He seemed unusually serious, and I could tell something was weighing heavily on his mind. After a long pause, he told me that our family's wealth, something we had always assumed came from hard work, was actually inherited from a distant relative who had made his fortune through dubious means. My grandfather explained that one of our ancestors had been a notorious bootlegger during Prohibition, and his illegal activities had funded much of the wealth that our family had built its reputation on. My grandfather had known about it all along, but never spoke of it. He had always been ashamed of the way our family fortune was made. He told me that he had tried to keep this information hidden, fearing it would tarnish the family name and reputation. He also said that when he had taken over the family business, he had worked tirelessly to distance himself from the criminal history that had fueled our wealth. It was a shocking revelation. I had always believed our family was built on hard work and integrity, but the truth painted a much more complicated picture. It made me question how much of our family's history was defined by the choices of others before us, and how much of what we had achieved was based on decisions that didn't align with the values we now held dear. Despite the shock, I came to realize that history is complicated, and that we must choose how we define ourselves moving forward. Story 25. For as long as I could remember, my family always seemed perfect. We went on vacations, celebrated holidays, and always supported each other through tough times. But when I was in my 20s, something happened that completely changed my perception of my parents and our family's history. One evening, my mom sat me down and said there was something she needed to tell me. She explained that when she and my father had first married, they had been in an open relationship for several years. During that time, they both had other partners. And while they were deeply in love with each other, they didn't want to be confined to traditional expectations of marriage. She went on to tell me that one of these relationships had resulted in a child, my half-sibling, who was now in their early 30s. I was stunned. My parents, who had always been the picture of stability, had been living a very different reality when they were young. My mom explained that she had kept the secret because she didn't want to hurt me or disrupt the family dynamic. She and my father had eventually closed the relationship when they realized they wanted a traditional family, but my half-sibling had been raised by their biological mother, unaware of us. The truth was shocking, but as my mom explained more, I came to understand that their unconventional choices had been based on their own beliefs and desires, not out of neglect or malice. My half-sibling reached out to me after the revelation, and we met. It was awkward at first, but over time, we built a relationship. It was a difficult truth to digest, but it was also a reminder that families don't always fit the traditional mold, and that sometimes the most unexpected truths can bring us closer together. Story 26. My family has always been fairly traditional, and we've never had much to hide. But one afternoon, something happened that changed the way I viewed my parents' relationship forever. It started when my mom asked me to help her clear out the attic. While digging through dusty boxes, I found an old suitcase with faded luggage tags. It seemed odd, and curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it. Inside was a collection of letters, photographs, and a small silver ring. The letters were from someone named Gordon, a name I didn't recognize. My first thought was that they were part of some old correspondence between my mom and a former friend. But as I started reading them, I discovered a far more shocking truth. The letters described an affair my mother had with Gordon, a man she had been deeply in love with long before meeting my father. I couldn't believe what I was reading. According to the letters, my mother had been involved with Gordon during a time when she and my father were separated. The affair had ended abruptly when my mom decided to reconcile with my dad. She never told anyone about it, not even my father. The silver ring was a gift from Gordon, and it had been hidden away in the attic for decades. After finding the letters, I was left with more questions than answers. When I confronted my mom, she broke down in tears. She admitted that it had been a difficult chapter in her life, but one she had closed long ago. She explained that she had loved Gordon deeply, but ultimately chose to rebuild her life with my father for the sake of their future. The secret had been hers to carry alone, and she never felt the need to bring it up, fearing it would complicate the life they had built together. It was difficult to process, but over time, I came to understand that my mother's choice wasn't a betrayal, but a complex decision she made in the pursuit of happiness and stability. The discovery didn't change how I saw her, but it did open my eyes to the complexities of love and relationships that are often kept hidden behind closed doors. Story 27. My family was always known for being outspoken and honest, so it took me completely by surprise when, at a family reunion, my aunt revealed a shocking secret. We had all gathered at my cousin's house for the usual barbecue, and after dinner, my aunt, who had always been the life of the party, stood up to make an announcement. With a serious expression, she said, "There's something I've never told any of you, and it's time you know the truth." The whole room went silent as we waited for her to continue. My aunt explained that many years ago, before she had married my uncle, she had been in an abusive relationship with a man who had manipulated and controlled her for years. She had been deeply ashamed of the relationship, too embarrassed to tell anyone, and when she finally left him, she had never looked back. What made the revelation even more shocking was the fact that the man in question had been one of my mother's close friends. He had been invited to family events, and no one had suspected anything out of the ordinary. My aunt had kept the relationship a secret because she feared that revealing it would damage my mother's reputation and create a scandal. Even after leaving the relationship, my aunt had kept her distance from my mom and the rest of the family, afraid that they would judge her. As my aunt shared her story, it became clear how much pain she had carried all these years. She had been silently keeping up the facade of a happy family, when in reality she had been trying to heal from a toxic relationship. The room was filled with mixed emotions. Some were stunned, while others were incredibly supportive. It was a moment of healing, both for my aunt and for the rest of the family, as we came together to offer her our unconditional love and understanding. Story 28. For as long as I could remember, my grandfather had always been the pillar of our family. He was a man of few words, but his presence was commanding, and everyone in the family looked up to him. It wasn't until after his death that we learned about a secret he had kept for decades. After his funeral, we were all gathered at his house going through his belongings when we found an old box tucked away in a drawer. The box was filled with letters, photographs, and a journal. At first, I thought it was just another collection of keepsakes. But then I noticed something strange. There were several letters addressed to a woman named Evelyn. Curious, I began reading through the letters, which told the story of my grandfather's life before he married my grandmother. He had been deeply in love with a woman named Evelyn, and they had planned to get married. But shortly before their wedding, Evelyn had disappeared, and my grandfather was left heartbroken. The letters revealed that she had been forced to leave town due to a family conflict, and my grandfather had never known what happened to her. He had tried to find her for years, but with no success. The journal entries detailed his pain and longing for Evelyn, and I realized that this had been a chapter in his life he had never shared with anyone. Even though he had gone on to marry my grandmother and had a family, my grandfather had always carried the memory of Evelyn in his heart. It was a love he had never forgotten. When I told my family about the discovery, my grandmother was silent for a long time. She had known about Evelyn, but she never spoke of her. My grandmother explained that after they had married, my grandfather had always been a loving and devoted husband, but she understood that he had never fully let go of the past. It was a bittersweet revelation, and it made me realize how complex and layered people's histories can be. My grandfather's secret love story was something he had kept hidden for years, but it didn't diminish the love he had for our family.